He plans on removing the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, bringing the Prophet's body back to the Holy Land, Jerusalem, and forcing Muslims to come and exhibit his body like a museum. Tracks the Crusaders to the city of Halayb in modern-day Sudan, only 500 kilometers away from Mecca. Any inkling of Crusader presence in Halayb was completely eviscerated.
نحن لن نستسلم.
Now I know what you're thinking. What is that giant thing on your face? It's called a beard. Idiot. Also, try to ignore the band-aid. It was supposed to heal by now, but it seems to be getting worse, and I don't have time. I gotta record this video, so. We left off last time with Salahudin establishing and consolidating his territories within Syria, and now he leaves his brother in charge in Syria so that he can go back to Egypt and face yet another Crusader force, led by Reynold of Chatalon, a man who would be pivotal to the story. Unfortunately, leading up to the battle, the Muslims make a terrible decision. They attempt to swap the right and left flanks so that they can have better positioning, but in that moment the Crusaders led a charge and struck deep into the Muslim lines while they were unprepared, forcing them to retreat into the Egyptian deserts. Now, the death of Nuruddin had released a lot of problems into Syria and into the Middle East in general, but one of the stinkiest of these problems was Reynold of Chatalon. Reynold spent 15 years in Syrian prisons before the death of Nuruddin, after which he was traded back to the Crusaders, probably for like a loaf of bread or something. He marries a wealthy woman and boom, now he's powerful. He was mainly known for two things, well, other than marrying the wealthy woman. One, he was extremely drunk all the time. Two, he was a staunch enemy of Islam. And it wasn't just political, like Guy and Baldwin and the other Crusaders. He personally hated the Prophet Muhammad and Muslims, and he would try to disgrace and dishonor the Prophet Muhammad in front of Muslims as much as he could. He would sometimes even go out of his way, completely disregard Crusader orders, and do his own raids on Muslim territories. He was pretty much the original redneck. However, unlike his descendants, he would not die in a barn from a fent overdose. His fate would actually come as a result of his words and ambitions against the Muslims, but that's coming later in the story. Now, I know you've probably heard countless stories about Salahuddin's generosity, so I'm not going to harp too much on that. I want to talk about his bravery. Salahuddin used to keep a very small royal guard. Unlike other kings who had massive armies surrounding them, Salahuddin kept a small guard, and he would often lure out the Crusaders himself. The Crusaders, who were usually very tenacious and trigger happy with their charges, knew better than to charge Salahuddin's guard, because he wasn't just a vulnerable king like the other kings. He was a very dangerous and capable commander and soldier. In times of peril, Salahuddin was the one who would charge in and save his men and change the course of the battle. When you're a man with this much aura, culturally and militarily of course, you're gonna gain enemies, and one of those enemies was a man named Izzuddin, who was the emir of Mosul at the time, which is in Iraq. Izzuddin sends letters to the Crusaders encouraging them to attack Salahuddin's territories, and then he follows this up by attacking the allies of Salahuddin and attacking Salahuddin's fort of Azaz, which he captured last episode from the Hashashins, completely destroying the fort. This incident was around 576 Hijri or 1180 Gregorian. Izzuddin was having his "come on everybody, let's get him" moment, but he didn't look behind him to realize that there was nobody behind him. I'm not sure if the Crusaders didn't get the memo in time or if Salahuddin just moves way too quickly, because Izzuddin would be completely on his own for this one. The Sultan is absolutely furious, gathering his forces and rapidly sweeping north across the Euphrates River, capturing Raqqa, Edessa, Sbisi, and Saruj with little trouble, before rapidly shifting east to target the emir's capital of Mosul. Izzuddin from inside Mosul starts to demand diplomacy from the Sultan. Salahuddin, being gracious and valuing the importance of Mosul as a Muslim stronghold, decides to move his forces away and target Sinjar instead to put pressure on Izzuddin. He takes Sinjar by the 2nd of Ramadan, and now Izzuddin is in panic mode. He sends letters to Shah Arman, who was his ally to the north, asking him to come rescue him. Shah Arman comes to Iraq with his army, puffs his chest, and he comes out to face Salahuddin. He sends out envoys to Salahuddin telling him to stop it, and Izzuddin comes out of Mosul with the same message. Stop it. I'm oversimplifying, alright? Weeks of deliberation back and forth between Salahudin and this coalition lead to nothing, and finally Salahudin decides to move in the direction of this army that had come to face him. Shah Arman sees that Salahudin is coming and he's like, well, I didn't expect that to happen. Immediately heads back to his territories. Izz-ad-Din is like, what the hell, dude? And he has to go back to Mosul, but now that he has no army to protect him, Mosul is taken by Salahudin within 8 days. And now the prized possession, Aleppo, was the true target. I'm always baffled at the complete weakness of Arab and Muslim leaders who choose to collaborate with non-Muslims against Muslims and Arabs. It's just fascinating to me. It is a result of greed, of course. Like, I mean, if you're gonna pay somebody off to fight his own people, I don't know how much you can expect him to really be reliable, brave, etc. But it's just always interesting to see them crumble so quickly and rapidly under very little pressure. It's fascinating. Salahudin surrounds the city of Aleppo, which was his true target this entire time. Small skirmishes are initiated between his army and the army of Izz-ad-Din inside. However, secret negotiations for the taking of the city were already underway. Salahudin didn't care about Mosul, the city that he had captured back in Iraq. Aleppo was a lot more important as it allowed him to completely surround the Crusaders from all sides. And he didn't necessarily care if Izz-ad-Din stayed in Mosul, as Izz-ad-Din clearly wasn't strong enough to do anything. And so a deal is struck. Izz-ad-Din is allowed to return to Mosul and rule from there, stay away from the Crusaders, and Salahudin would take the city of Aleppo. The Sultan enters the city. He honors the emir and his men for respecting their agreement. He gives them robes as a sign of respect, and he sends them back to Iraq. And now Salahudin had the Crusaders completely surrounded. Now it seems that at this very moment, the fat pigeon that Izz-ad-Din had sent to the Crusaders must have finally reached them, because Reynold of Chatalon chooses this very moment to assemble a fleet and launch an attack on the Muslim Holy Land. And I'm not talking about Jerusalem, I'm talking about Mecca and Medina. He plans on removing the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, bringing the Prophet's body back to the Holy Land, Jerusalem, and forcing Muslims to come and exhibit his body like a museum. Reynold's fleet splits into two forces. One of them target Aqaba outside of Sinai, and the other sail for the Muslim Holy Land of Mecca and Medina. The Muslim response to this foolish attack would be swift and decisive. Salahuddin's brother in Egypt rapidly assembles a navy to respond to this force. The commander of this force pinpoints the Crusaders outside of Aqaba and completely wipes them out before moving south to hunt down the rest of the Crusader forces. He tracks the Crusaders to the city of Halayb in modern-day Sudan, only 500 kilometers away from Mecca. Any inkling of Crusader presence in Halayb was completely eviscerated. Any remaining Crusaders were hunted down except for Reynold of Chatalon, who managed to get back on a fleet and escape to Kerak. He would not personally face a direct response for his actions yet. This victory at the Red Sea was not enough for the Muslims. They wanted more. The Muslim navy moves and attacks yet another Crusader fleet, killing and capturing thousands of Crusaders and taking hundreds of horses away from them. The Muslim forces in Syria, led by Salahudin, also prepare their response, initiating a march on the Crusader territories in Syria, marching for the city of Kerak. The Sultan's army then pinpoints and surrounds the main Crusader force, encircling them from all directions and slamming them with swords and arrows. The Crusaders, however, sense danger, and instead of engaging the Sultan's forces, lock into a very tight defensive formation. The Crusaders set up their encampment while remaining in a very tight formation, in fear of the horrors that might befall them when night comes. Salahuddin is persistent in breaking this formation from the Crusaders. However, the encirclement doesn't seem to be working, and so he switches his strategy. Instead of making the Crusaders feel like he's putting pressure on their heads, he instead decides to entice them. He breaks his army into sections and he starts marching with his men in a very vulnerable way. He then takes his royal guard, circles a mountain, and waits underneath, watching and waiting for the Crusaders' reaction. Sure enough, the Crusaders decide to break their formation, and at that moment the Muslim army switched back into attack mode, slamming the Crusaders with precise arrows through their helmets. Salahuddin's guard leaves the mountain and initiates a charge against the Crusaders, but in that moment they lock back into their formation and they very quickly leave the area, and the Muslims decide to pull back after being advised that they were running out of arrows. Now, Salahuddin's main strategy was to play around with the Crusaders' tendency to do very heavy forward charges. While the Crusaders, like most armies at this time, used to move like a block in one big unit, Salahuddin was a lot more creative, distributing his men all over the battlefield to lure the Crusaders into certain areas, and then using his main force to deal a decisive blow. By luring the Crusaders into a charge, he would pull apart this block and then target vulnerable areas, splitting the Crusader army, causing chaos and disorder as they fall over each other in their very unnecessarily heavy armor, and then picking off the Crusaders one unit at a time. Reynold's men return to Kerak and Salahuddin returns to Damascus. However, Salahuddin is not done. He sends a letter to his brother in Egypt and he tells him it's time to initiate an attack on Kerak. This stronghold, which was belonging to Reynold of Chatalon, was a huge problem to the Muslims. It was right in the middle of the Syrian and Egyptian territories, and it regularly disrupted communication, as well as put pilgrims in danger. The Muslims march out to take Kerak. However, Salahuddin notices the sheer amount of reinforcements arriving to the city, and he realizes that these reinforcements have to be coming from somewhere. He instead shifts his plans and attacks Nablus and Jenin in the Holy Land, bringing their defenses completely to the ground. The time to take Kerak from Reynold was still young, and a treaty is eventually agreed upon between the Muslims and the Crusaders, and for now, they would put their differences aside. The next several years of Salahuddin's reign would be defined by his wars against other Muslim emirs. Thousands of Muslims would die at the hands of other Muslims during this era. I'm sorry if it's hard to follow. Essentially, just remember this. Salahuddin goes back and forth fighting the Crusaders, fighting the Emirs, fighting the Crusaders, fighting the Emirs. I'm sorry if it's getting confusing. This would finally culminate in a peace treaty when Salahuddin would fall ill in the year 1186. And for anyone saying, oh, Salahuddin was the problem, if you make peace with a tumor in your body, you might feel at peace right now, but you 10 years from now might be very upset with you at that decision. That winter, however, the Muslims would be forced to redirect their attention away from themselves and face the Crusaders once again, as Reynold of Chatalon would do yet another egregious crime against the Muslims. He completely shatters the peace treaty between Salahuddin and King Baldwin, targeting a Hajji caravan going from Syria to Mecca. When the pilgrims in the caravan clarified to Reynold that they were part of a peace treaty, he tells them that the peace treaty does not apply to him, and he encourages them to bring out the Prophet Muhammad, or as he calls him, that sheep herder from Mecca, to come and save them from his grasp. Upon receiving information about this attack, Salahuddin puts his hand on his sword, unsheaths it, and lifts it into the air, and promises that he will shed the blood of Reynold of Chatalon with his own hands. And that is next time's episode. Thank you so much for watching. I'm sorry it got dark. It took me a really long time to record this. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'll see you in part 3.
ولا تظن أنها النهاية.